Hello, my name is Elliot of Tool Nerd TV, and welcome to this week's episode of Box to Box Score, where we look at the GW7 Premier and Championship games from Game Week 7. We're going to move right into the first game here, the first game of the Premiership, or the Premier League, I should say. EPL Mostradamus against Ben Dinnery, with Mostradamus picking up the win, kind of arresting his lack of form over the last few games. He'd had a few losses, but he's come back to the party now. And speaking of party, we've got Gylfi Sigurdsson on his team being the star performer. He's come to the party, as it were. 32 points for him this week, 2 goals and a missed penalty as well, so could have even been a little bit more there. We asked Ben Dinnery with regards to Marcus Rashford. We said what were his thoughts there about him and the unrest at Manchester United, and whether his goal against West Ham gives him a little bit more playing time. And Ben said, hoping his goal can lock in a start against Newcastle, that's of course who they face this weekend, but that may depend on the Champions League performance, both collectively and individually, from the likes of Sanchez, who will have a point to prove after being dropped from the matchday squad on Saturday. That's very true. I would agree that Sanchez did have a point to prove, having been dropped from the squad altogether against West Ham, but I'm recording this today after the Champions League game for Manchester United against Valencia. And it's impossible to know what Mourinho's going to do with his squad based on the performances of all his players. Going forward, they just seem to completely lack imagination or confidence. There is something deeply wrong at Manchester United at the moment, and it's impossible to know what's going to happen with them. Rashford arguably had the best chance actually for United last night in the Champions League. He took a free kick from a tightish angle that hit the bar on its way over. But I mean, that was really pretty much it when it came to good chances for them. So it's extremely difficult to know what's going to happen with him or his club going forward in the next few weeks this season. We move on to the second game. We've got TR Kingston against TA Mac 10. Pretty easy win for TR Kingston in this particular game, and the kind of standout performer for him, pretty close in that front, but David Silva for Man City against Brighton, who had yet another kind of virtuoso performance that he so likes putting in for the team. As well as Fernandinho actually scoring a little bit more points than David Silva, but a pretty impressive victory for City, even though it was only 2-0. And we asked TR Kingston about how he's been successful riding the Man City players so far this season, and did he have any concerns with regards to maybe being a bit City heavy? But he said, no, not at all, as I expect them to pace the league again this season, which again, I would agree with. I think that's a fair assessment, but the only risk that you'll run with having Man City players from a fantasy perspective is, of course, being at the mercy of Guardiola's rotation. He can't play every one of his talented players, particularly in the forward areas, at once, and that also goes for the defence, actually, to be fair. If you look at Laporte, Stones, Otamendi, Kompany, they can't all play at once, so it's going to be tricky to fit all of the Man City players in there. But then we've known that for a few years, so it's nothing new to us. We move on to the third game here. We have JWL 15 against Roto Z Droik. A pretty close game actually, but decided by Roto Z Droik even, including Sane in the team, who got himself an assist against Brighton this weekend. Pretty impressive performance again, like I said, from Man City, but he could have maybe expected a little bit more from Lukaku, as we've already discussed. A little bit of a crisis there at Manchester United against West Ham. It was particularly prevalent. We move on to the next game. We're probably the game of the week, actually. Nickard taking on Fuzzy Warbles. I wish Nickard luck on Twitter this weekend, and it looks as though it worked, because he picked up the win against Fuzzy Warbles. He, going into this weekend, was the formed team. He had the most wins out of anyone in the league, and he still put together a pretty impressive 141 points, but it was Nickard with the inclusion of Lacazette for Arsenal getting his assist against Watford in their win. The 2 goals came pretty quickly for Arsenal. They ran away with the game very quickly. And also there Goodmanson with his goal and assist for Burnley, who looks again as though he might be the kind of spark that Burnley have in attack this season. We go on to the next game, WRI Gavin against Jason UK. Gavin retaining top spot this week in the Premier League with another victory in another close game, actually, 135 points to 131.6. This one decided by Harry Kane and his pretty monstrous haul of 40 points. Just a couple of goals there. Signs that maybe he is sort of getting back to sharpness from his performance against Huddersfield, but again, even Pochettino acknowledged that there's perhaps a little way to go in some of the press conferences he gave after the match before Kane comes back to full sharpness. And with this being a tricky week for Tottenham in the Champions League against Barcelona and a tricky game against Cardiff and fixture congestion possibly playing a part, we will wait and see what Harry Kane does sort of going forward this season. So let's have a look at the table and where that leaves us in terms of the standings. So we've got Gavin, like I said, retaining top spot and opening up a bit of daylight now, actually, between him and second place. Fuzzy Warble's no longer kind of keeping pace. He's dropped one back. So it's a 2-win gap now between Gavin and the rest of the league. So we move on to our commercial. So this week I'd like to just thank our sponsors, Feline Rough, who have basically given us a message. They've said looking for that perfect toy for your pet. Feline Rough started in 2016 to make unique pet toys and provide a fresh take on the stale assortment of cat toys on the market. And with their 100% money back guarantee, you can't afford to not give it a shot. Be sure to find all their offerings on Amazon today. So feel free to check them out. We thank them once again for sponsoring this episode. On to the first game of the championship. We have Yamar picking up a pretty routine win over FPL MNOP. A pretty disastrous week for him with only the 51 points, but it was enough for Yamar to keep his win streak going. It's still the longest active streak out of the whole YEFSA leagues, and the inclusion of Irish Doherty actually proving beneficial with his assist against Southampton in Wolves. A very impressive win. They really look like they've taken to the Premier League like ducks to water this season. They're very impressive. We move on to the second game of the championship, and this was definitely the closest game that I've seen all season, decided by just 0.4 points between Gary Owen and Hambazaza. Gary picking up the win in this particular case. No standout players as such, because it was a very close game, fairly low scoring, but Michael Keane being the top scorer for Gary in this particular week, with Everton's clean sheet against Fulham, of course. Moving on to the next one, we have Tom Sunderland picking up a pretty big win against Roto Wire Andrew. The 145 points mainly contributed to by Emerick Laporte. Again, mentioning Man City's pretty impressive defensive stand against Brighton this week. Never really looked in much trouble, so it's a fairly easy clean sheet for them. And yeah, a pretty easy win for Tom Sunderland. We move on to CJ Radun against Sports by Gotti. A win for CJ Radun in this game for 114 points, mainly thanks to the work of Raheem Sterling against Brighton. A goal and an assist for him. He really looks like the player to have out of all of that front group at the moment for City. Sterling looks like the one who's most exciting at the moment in terms of a fantasy perspective. He's just getting goals and assists for fun, it seems, in the first sort of few weeks of this season. So we move on to the next game, Jay Forker against Neil Thurman. Another pretty one-sided game. Neil Thurman picking up a pretty big win in this one. Johnny of Wolves scoring against Southampton this week. He was the main kind of points getter there. But Eden Hazard as well, who scored his goal against Liverpool in their home game. Pretty tricky game against Liverpool. He was there on hand to help for the victory as well. So where does that leave us for the championship? Well, like I mentioned, Yamar's got the longest active winning streak, so he retains top spot. But Tom Sunderland kind of staying on his heels a little bit. 3-game winning streak for him. And Gary Owen just below him as well after his extremely close win over Hambazaza. So that is it for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you next week for Box to Box Score for Game Week 8. Thank you for watching.